Martin Luther King Jr., a prophet for our time. Prelude Part 1, Grade School and Morehouse College. A precocious, inquisitive child bursting with questions. African American religious traditions and Martin Luther King Jr. King Jr., as I said before, was born on 15 January 1929 at his home in Atlanta. From the moment of his birth, according to the papers of Martin Luther King Jr., his extended family connected him to African American religious traditions. Immersed in religion at home and in church, King acquired skills and contacts that would serve him well once he accepted his calling as a minister. He saw his father and grandfather as appealing role models who combined pastoring with social activism. Although King's theological curiosity and public ministry would take him far from his Auburn Avenue origins, his basic identity remained rooted in Baptist church traditions that were intertwined with his family history. Of course, when it is not checked, race rears its ugly head everywhere. At just 6 years of age, King Jr. had an experience that profoundly affected his attitudes towards white people. King recalled playing with a white friend. We always felt free to play our childhood games together. He did not live in our community, but he was usually around every day because his father owned a store across the street from our home. At the age of 6, we both entered school. Separate schools, of course. I remember how our friendship began to break as soon as we entered school. This was not my desire, but his. The climax came when he told me one day that his father had demanded that he would play with me no more. And so at the dinner table, King discussed the incident with his parents. They told him about the heartbreaks of racism. King recalled his reaction, quote, "From that moment on, I was determined to hate every white person," unquote. King's baptism. Years later at CROZER Theological Seminary, King confessed his lack of interest back when he had joined the church as a young boy. Here's his recollection. I joined the church at the age of 5. I well remember how this event occurred. Our church was in the midst of the spring revival, and a guest evangelist had come down from Virginia. On Sunday morning, the evangelist came into our Sunday school to talk to us about salvation. And after a short talk on this point, he extended an invitation to any of us who wanted to join the church. My sister was the first one to join the church that morning, and after seeing her join, I decided that I would not let her get ahead of me, so I was the next. I had never given this matter a thought, and even at the time of my baptism, I was unaware of what was going on. From this, it seems quite clear that I joined the church not out of any dynamic conviction, but out of a childhood desire to keep up with my sister. King Jr.'s path through Atlanta's grade schools. The Stanford University project on the papers of Martin Luther King Jr. placed the official start to King's early schooling as January 1935. Clayton Carson, autobiography of King, takes the story up here. After a half year as a first grader, he was promoted to second grade due to a restart from a failed early entry the previous year. In the fall of 1936, he entered the third grade at David T. Howard Elementary School, where he remained through sixth grade. He then entered the Laboratory High School of Atlanta University, an experimental progressive school that appealed to black residents seeking alternatives to Atlanta's crowded public schools. He completed 2 years there, earning generally good grades except for a failing grade in social studies before the school was closed. I want to insert here things that we're going to be working with in the future. So this is sort of a foreshadowing that I call the dark destiny of a prophet from August 39 to August 63. By the time King Jr. was 10 years old, a great number of anti-fascists around the world had joined communist parties. Certainly they did in Europe and America. One of them happened to be a future King Nemesis, a man who was the circulation manager of the American Communist Party, the ACP. A few days before King's entry into 5th grade, Joseph Stalin and Adolf Hitler made the Nazi-Soviet pact. That was on 23 August 39. Like most of the people who had joined the ACP, King's future nemesis fled from the ACP. This opportunist, however, stole the ACP Chicago money and fled with it to Mexico City. There he was caught by the men working for another future King nemesis, J. Edgar Hoover, who promptly forced this criminal to infiltrate civil rights leaders for the FBI to avoid going to prison. 24 years later, after his 28 August 1963 I Have a Dream speech in Washington, King Jr. would discover this villain had penetrated his inner circle. As said above, at that time, the penetrator was working for the Office of Security in the Central Intelligence Agency. A lot more on this coming in a forthcoming work of mine on MLK. Meanwhile, King Jr. endured more encounters with racism. During his second year at Booker T. Washington High, King Jr. won a preliminary public speaking contest, an event that propelled him to compete in a Georgia statewide oratorial contest. Carson King's biography describes what happened on the way home. That night, Mrs. Bradley and I were on a bus returning to Atlanta. Along the way, some white passengers boarded the bus, and the white driver ordered us to get up and give the whites our seats. We didn't move quickly enough to suit him, so he began cursing us. I intended to stay right in that seat, but Mrs. Bradley urged me up, saying we had to obey the law. We stood up in the aisle for 90 miles to Atlanta. That night will never leave my memory. It was the angriest I've ever been in my life. King Jr.'s concerns during his first years at Morehouse College. When he was 15 years old, King entered the school that his father and maternal grandfather had attended, Morehouse College. Carson King's MLK autobiography offers these King recollections about his time at Morehouse. I shall never forget the hardships that I had upon entering college. For though I had been one of the top students in high school, I was still reading at only an 8th grade level. I went to college from the 11th grade. I never went to the 12th grade and skipped another grade earlier. So I was a pretty young fellow at Morehouse. When I went to Morehouse as a freshman in 1944, my concern for racial and economic justice was already substantial. During my student days, I read Henry David Thoreau's essay on civil disobedience for the first time. Here, in this courageous New Englander's refusal to pay his taxes and his choice of jail rather than support of a war that would spread slavery's territory into Mexico, I made my first contact with the theory of nonviolent resistance. Fascinated by the idea of refusing to cooperate with an evil system, I was so deeply moved that I reread the work several times. King's views on racial justice. During his freshman year at Morehouse, King Jr.'s professor, Gladstone Lewis, helped him prepare for the John L. Webb oratorial competition. King won second prize in that event twice, in 1946 and 1948. A series of racial hate crimes in Georgia were the subject of a letter King wrote to the editor of the Atlanta Constitution in the summer of 1946. Claiborne Carson mentioned King's changing views on racial justice. As soon as I entered college, I started working with the organizations that were trying to make racial justice a reality. The wholesome relations we had in the Intercollegiate Council convinced me that we had many white persons as allies, particularly among the younger generation. I had been ready to resent the whole white race, but as I got to see more of white people, my resentment was softened and a spirit of cooperation took its place. Well, as King grew more, there were doubts, religious doubts, as he said, that spring forth unrelentingly. King recalled how he reacted to the many doubts that he had during his first years at Morehouse. He said, "It was then that the shackles of fundamentalism were removed from my body. More and more I could see a gap between what I had learned in Sunday school and what I was learning in college. My studies had made me skeptical, and I could not see how many of the facts of science could be squared with religion. I revolted, too, against the emotionalism of much Negro religion, the shouting and stamping. I didn't understand it, and it embarrassed me. I often say that if we as a people had as much religion in our hearts and souls as we had on our legs and feet, we could change the world." King recalled how two men, Dr. Mays, president of Morehouse College, and Dr. George Kelsey, a professor of philosophy and religion, made me stop and think. Both were ministers, both deeply religious, and yet both were learned men, aware of all the trends of modern thinking. I could see in their lives the ideal of what I wanted a minister to be. King Jr.'s decision to enter the ministry. During his first 3 years at Morehouse, King had planned on becoming a lawyer or a physician. But in his final year in 1948, he finally accepted the challenge of entering the ministry. After King's trial sermon at his dad's church, Ebenezer, the congregation there licensed King to preach as an associate professor, and he was ordained as a minister. As King Jr. recalled, "Of course I was religious. My father is a preacher. My grandfather was a preacher. My great-grandfather was a preacher. My only brother is a preacher. My daddy's brother is a preacher. So I didn't have much choice." Martin Luther King Jr., a prophet for our time. Prelude Part 2, still at the CROZER Theological Seminary, an adolescent prodigy still bursting with questions. In his own words, Martin Luther King recalls his youth. "From the very beginning, I was an extraordinarily healthy child. It is said that at my birth, the doctors pronounced me, from a physical point of view, a 100% perfect child. I hardly know how an ill moment feels. I guess the same thing would apply to my mental life. I have always been somewhat precocious physically and mentally, so it seems that from a hereditary point of view, nature has been very kind to me. The first 25 years of my life were very comfortable years. If I had a problem, I could always call Daddy. things were solved. Life had been wrapped up for me in a Christmas package. That isn't to say that I was born with a silver spoon in my mouth. Far from it. I always had a desire to work, and I would spend my summers working. King had to come from behind during his first semester at CROZER. In 1948, when King Jr. requested an application for admission to CROZER Theological Seminary in Chester, Pennsylvania, there were doubts about his intellectual ability. King secured letters from his father and several family friends, but the comments of those who knew King well were restrained in their assessments of his intellectual ability. Morehouse religion professor Lucius Tobin, who had not taught King, could only report that he came from a fine family and was a little above average in scholarship. When King Jr. began his studies at CROZER Theological Seminary in the fall of 1948, he was just 19 years old, younger than most of his CROZER classmates. And so, King quickly immersed himself in CROZER's intellectual environment. King had a prodigious plan of study. His experiences at CROZER helped him begin a new quest centering on elimination of social evil. In his own words, not until 1948, when I entered CROZER Theological Seminary, did I begin a serious intellectual quest for a method to eliminate social evil. I turned to a serious study of the social and ethical theories of the great philosophers, from Plato and Aristotle, down to Rousseau, Hobbes, Bentham, Mill, and Locke. All of these masters stimulated my thinking, such as it was. And while finding things to question in each of them, I nevertheless learned a great deal from their study. It's interesting that King felt he could do a critical analysis of these great minds. Among the great social philosophers that King studied, Walter Rauschenbusch's Christianity and the Social Crisis stands out. King recalled that it left an indelible imprint on his thinking by, quote, giving me a theological basis for the social concern which had already grown up in me as a result of my early experiences. Sermons at Ebenezer and Studies at CROZER. The Stanford University project on the papers of Martin Luther King lays out his academic studies at CROZER and his progress at preaching at Ebenezer. On 20 February 1949, King Jr. delivered the annual youth sermon at Ebenezer. At CROZER 2 days later, King enrolled in Christian mysticism, practical preaching, and public speaking. Over the summer, he served as assistant pastor at Ebenezer, delivering sermons, lectures, and preachings. For example, on 12 June, he preached at Mount Pleasant Baptist Church in the morning and at Ebenezer in the evening. During his first term of his second year at CROZER, King enrolled in public worship, Greek religion, Christian theology for today, and later that year he was named chairman of the student body devotional committee. From 20 September to 10 June 1950, King also audited a course of the philosophy of history at the University of Pennsylvania. Continuing, in 1950, King Jr. continued preaching at Ebenezer. In February and May at CROZER, he took courses in the history of living religions and the history of Christianity. In that month, he was also elected president of the CROZER student body. In September 1950, King began his senior year at CROZER, taking courses in American Christianity, colonial period, minister's use of the radio, and religious development of personality. He also served as student pastor at the First Baptist Church in Queens, New York. In early 1951, King audited courses on the problems of aesthetics and Immanuel Kant at the University of Pennsylvania, and he enrolled in philosophy of religion and theological integration at CROZER. In addition, he was accepted as a student in the postgraduate school of the Faculty of Divinity at Edinburgh University in Scotland. King had a remarkable finish at CROZER Seminary. In May 1951, he graduated from CROZER with a Bachelor of Divinity degree and delivered the valedictory address at the commencement. He received the Pearl Flaker Memorial Award as the outstanding member of his class during his courses in the seminary. King also received the John L. Lewis CROZER Fellowship that provided him with $1,200 toward graduate school. During the summer, King served as pastor in charge at Ebenezer. Having successfully competed with white students with his election as the president of the CROZER student body, King was then accepted for doctoral study at Boston's University School of Theology. This is something that's close to my heart, King on Reinhold Niebuhr. Carson's MLK autobiography recalls King's developing views on Niebuhr. During my last year in theological school, I began to read the works of Reinhold Niebuhr. The prophetic and realistic elements in Niebuhr's passionate style and profound thought were appealing to me and made me aware of the complexity of human motives and the reality of sin on every level of man's existence. I became so enamored of his social ethics that I almost fell into the trap of accepting uncritically everything he wrote. Once again, we find King's passion for critical analysis. Continuing here, I read Niebuhr's critique of the pacifist position. His break with pacifism came in the early 1930s. And the first full statement of his criticism of pacifism was in his book, Moral Man and Immoral Society. Here he argued that there was no intrinsic moral difference between violent and nonviolent resistance. The social consequences of the two methods were different, he contended, but the differences were in degree rather than in kind. Later, Niebuhr began emphasizing the irresponsibility of relying on nonviolent resistance when there was no ground for believing that it would be successful in preventing the spread of totalitarian tyranny. It could only be successful, Niebuhr argued, if the groups against whom the resistance was taking place had some degree of moral conscience, as was the case in Gandhi's struggle against the British. Niebuhr's great contribution to theology is that he has refuted the false optimism characteristic of a great segment of Protestant liberalism. Moreover, Niebuhr has extraordinary insight into human nature. His theology is a persistent reminder of the reality of sin on every level of man's existence. These elements in Niebuhr's thinking helped me to recognize the illusions of a superficial optimism concerning human nature and the dangers of a false idealism. While I still believed in man's potential for good, Niebuhr made me realize his potential for evil as well. Moreover, Niebuhr helped me to recognize the complexity of man's social involvement and the glaring reality of collective evil. Dr. King eventually lost interest in the social gospel altogether. Niebuhr's Moral Man and Immoral Society was published in 1932, when King was just 3 years old. That work was the beginning of the end of classical liberalism in American theology, because Niebuhr successfully attacked the social gospel's premise that the modern advance of reason could eliminate social evils. Niebuhr argued that there was no evidence that human beings became less predatory as they became better educated. King biographer Taylor Branch put it this way: if Niebuhr was correct, any social gospel preacher was necessarily a charlatan, and the Negroes among them were spiritual profiteers, enjoying the immense rewards of the Negro pulpit while dispensing a false doctrine of hope. Such a prospect deeply disturbed King, who already felt guilty about his privileges compared with the other Negro students at CROZER. After contact with the works of NIEBUHR, King lost interest in the social gospel overnight. The trauma was such that King was never again so completely influenced by any school of thought, including NIEBUHR's.